Okay, hello everyone. I am your host for season 2 of the Fearless Futures podcast. My name is Sable Lomax. Pronouns are she and her. Today, I'm super excited that we get to speak to someone who I'm assuming it's a sunny day in California. For episode 5, we are going to be talking about how to build an inclusion and equity team. Megan has a specialty. I'm calling it a specialty in this space, has great experience doing so. And I know that organizations oftentimes seek to do this or might be having conversations about doing it is usually part of a strategy. So I'm really, really excited for today's conversation. So who do we have? We have none other than Megan Kollar Dwyer. Megan Kollar Dwyer is the Senior Director of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Zendesk. Megan leads the strategy and teams focused on sourcing diverse talent communities, diversity business partners, and driving equity and inclusion throughout all people, processes, and practices. She blends D&I, subject matter expertise, with extensive learning and development experience, D&I consulting work, strategic partnership skills, and a strong belief that we all have the capacity for change. Megan, welcome. How are you today? It's still a little early on your side.
It is, but I'm doing well. I've been looking forward to this, and I'm so happy to be here.
Before we dive in, because I'm really excited, like I said, to chat about this conversation, because it's a topic that if you don't already have a DEI team internally or a committee, conversations might be happening. It might be something you're considering for the future. And I do think it's really, really insightful to be able to get some tips along the way, lessons learned, and so forth and so forth. But before we go there, I've been asking this question of every guest thus far, and it's now your turn. Don't be alarmed. It's not a tricky question whatsoever. But in terms of your experience with equity and inclusion, what has been a mic drop learning moment for you? So this could be like the first time you thought about equity in the first place, or just like a key moment, a pivotal moment that will always, ring true for you.
There are so many. I think part of being in this space professionally inherently means I'm having mic drop moments all the time, like years and years in, because we're always learning. Yeah. Like our own knowledge of our own identities and the communities around us is always changing and evolving. But two stand out to me when you ask today, at least. One is, I think back to my time in university when I took a course that I wasn't sure what I was getting into. It was one of the, it qualified for some sort of general ed credit. And it was what was available. And it ended up being an exploration of multiracial and multi-ethnic solidarity and coalitions in U.S. history.
As a general ed requirement, I think I'm jealous, but keep going.
Yeah, that really was what the focus was. And I got to learn from incredible folks in that course. And really a mic drop moment was the power of coalitions and solidarity, and the fact that there are so many examples in history of those coalitions being true that I had never been exposed to. And so it was like a real awakening. I learned a lot about the history of Los Angeles. We ended up doing like a case study, and the moments in which that very large and diverse city has built multi-ethnic, multiracial coalitions to create positive change. And so that was certainly a mic drop. And it stays with me now is, how do we do this work in solidarity? And then second, I'll say there too, I have learned a tremendous amount from the disability community. I myself have a disability, and I'm always learning. And just the fundamentals of inclusive design, of this concept of asking the question, who are we centering? Are we taking, an approach where we are thinking about the most excluded, the most marginalized, the most underserved users, or whatever the framing might be? That feels sort of inherent to this equity work now, but there was a moment in time in which I realized asking the question, who are we centering? Who do we need to decenter? whose needs are we really trying to meet was pretty aha for me.
Actually, I'm thinking, oftentimes, because Fearless Futures, as you know, we facilitate trainings and education, and people will often ask, what's something we can do now? Generally speaking, I think that participants are looking for something very active and physical in nature. But just those two questions that you highlighted, and we often will share it. It's like, well, first, if you slow down and think through for yourself, who am I prioritizing? Who am I deprioritizing? That alone is a significant start to adjusting the way in which you go about your day-to-day work, whatever that might be. I appreciate that as like a mic drop moment, because it doesn't feel significant sometimes for people, but it really does begin to change the way in which you view whatever work you're doing, by thinking, who am I centering, like you said, and who might I be decentering, and what's the impact of being decentered in that particular context or scenario. So I really I like that. I like that. Okay, talk to us. How did you come to this work? Because when you ask children, and I don't think it's a fair question to ask children, but what do you want to be when you grow up? You hear dancer, doctor, lawyer, teacher, sometimes engineer, depending on, who they've been exposed to. I don't think there's a child that, maybe now, but I haven't met them or heard a story where they're like, I want to do work in the equity and inclusion space at the age of 5. So it's like, how did you come to this work?
I love that question, Sable, and that observation, because I think we all come to this work in unique ways. And it's one of the things that makes doing this work so great. And for folks who are interested in either getting more formally involved in diversity, equity, inclusion work, or who are currently finding themselves into that work, I think we've all taken circuitous paths. And so I love that you're asking this. I mean, a couple things for me, lots of our stories start early on. And I was raised initially by, my parents were both police officers, which is pretty unique. And we're white. So both my parents are white. And I grew up in the 80s. And watching and learning from what it was like for them to be in those positions of power, and to learn and sometimes not learn, and be aware and sometimes not be aware of systemic oppression, of the impact of racial profiling, which in many places was actually like encouraged at the time in police departments. And I grew up in Southern California, and so hence some of the interest in LA history. We had conversations about this pretty early on, about things like power and racism, and even just racializing people. I watched my parents make a lot of mistakes. Both of them ended up leaving the profession. That's early stage. Like, this is I wasn't consciously thinking, oh, wow, what I want to do is I want to get into equity work, because I still didn't have exposure to that. But those are some of the seeds being planted. And then I really credit a lot of how I got to where I am in this work, large part due to the education I had access to.
Yeah.
So I was lucky enough to study at an institution where Claude Steele became the dean while I was there. Okay. And he had coined the term stereotype threat. So learned from folks like him and Carol Dweck, who set up a growth mindset lab, some real important folks who were thinking about the impact of things like stereotype threat and the mindsets we have for others and ourselves. And that led me to education. That's where I started my career as a classroom teacher. I was lucky enough to teach in Oakland in the Bay Area. That's where I lived for a long time before moving down to San Diego. And I worked alongside family members and incredible activists in that community. I mean, there is such a rich history in Oakland of folks steeped in their lived experiences of transformative and restorative justice and, expanding access. So all of those led me to ultimately realize, wait a minute, there's a world in which you can do this work full time. You can do this work intentionally, and you can do it in the corporate sector, which wasn't something I was aware of for a long time.
And that last point, there's so many spaces that many of us are unaware of as possibilities for, work. So how many teams have you built in the past?
So I've either built or been a part of building 4 equity and inclusion teams at different organizations. So one at an education technology company, one at a DEI consulting firm, one at a larger technology company. And again, I'm still in technology now.
Okay. So you have, I knew it was more than 2, but I just wanted to confirm. You have some experience with building teams from, I'm just going to say from scratch, and essentially growing and building a department from scratch that's no easy feat, no matter what the department or team is. And I'd argue it's probably, or has the potential to be, even more challenging and requiring a little bit more craftiness to the approach, because oftentimes folks aren't seeing the value in having a full team to do this work and assume that like one person can take on the responsibility for all the work that has to be done. When you're building a team, what's front of mind for you during this process?
Building an equity and inclusion team isn't easy, but it's worthwhile work.
Very true. Very true.
What is kind of front of mind in the building phase really is, in my experience, and I've learned lessons the hard way here and also, been reinforced and able to do this successfully, is there has to be a co-creation and a leader-led approach. Like there needs to be, what we know doesn't work, and many organizations have tried, is to just prop up a DEI team or a diversity, inclusion, belonging team or a justice, equity, diversity. Yeah, we're throwing the acronyms, all important things. And then to say, okay, great, you have to figure it out, right? Like our employees are not feeling a strong sense of belonging. Hey, 2 people on the DEI team, you need to figure this out, right? Or we need you to fix it. That approach is not going to be effective, right? One, because we know 2 people really don't actually have access to influence and power in a massive culture change way within an organization. And it's missing, I think, the key point, which is their shared ownership, right? This sort of leader-led model.
Yeah. I like that you're highlighting that, because oftentimes what we'll see is, we have a team who's responsible for that. And there's separation and, mindsets between what senior leadership is responsible for, and then what the DEI team, INE team, INB team, whatever, B for belonging in this instance, is responsible for. And that disconnect between the two, like you said, it doesn't set a team up to be successful in the end. So I love that. You're getting right in there. Like, first of all, this is something that needs to be considered. If you had to say or explain to someone, knowing what you just shared in terms of a leader-led approach, what would you say is the purpose of putting together a DEI team in the first place?
One is there really are incredible subject matter experts in this field. I think that needs to be said because many of us have a combination of, passion, interest, lived experience, and learned experience. And this field, just like other fields, requires skill building and knowledge acquisition, and really requires diverse teams too, right? Because like I mentioned, the power of solidarity and coalitions, we can't do this work alone. So whether that's that you're able to build out and resource the team internally, or who are the communities, the organizations, the voices that you're pulling in to do this work. Yes, exactly. Because oftentimes it starts small. So you might be the only one, or the one of 2 on the team, right? And so as you advocate for more resources to grow the diversity and the size of your own team, there are lots of ways to acquire that subject matter expertise. And I want to be super clear that lived experience is a key element of that expertise, but is not the only piece. And so I think sometimes, because I think there's a risk factor here and a let's get it right piece. And the risk factor is that we assume that people who we often consider represent quote unquote diversity in an organization, which really means come from historically or currently underrepresented, under-resourced, under-accessed communities, that somehow that just means you should do this DEI work, right? Like we know that, and sometimes it's unintentional and sometimes it's intentional, that burden gets placed on folks who are carrying the identities. And there are a lot of people who want to do DEI work who come from those communities. Many of us do, but not all of us. And so there's a purpose of having a DEI team and really bringing in folks to do this work intentionally, so that you're not burdening your employees who likely are underrepresented within the organization to just figure out as they go how to do this formally, often on top of their day job.
You know, I'm really, really glad that you mentioned that, because oftentimes I think this field doesn't get the same respect that other fields get. So just top of mind, I'm thinking an engineer or a psychologist, a sociologist, and so forth, and so a biologist. I mean, all the fields you can think of. And there's this idea that, like you said, you can just pull someone in and they're going to be able to go. And the danger in assuming that representation of a particular identity group, you know, those who've been are marginalized and have been historically, can just sit in this seat miraculously and tell you this is what's required for inclusion and equity. And that is sometimes the case, and sometimes it's not. And really leaning into the nuance there, that just because someone is from a particular group does not mean that they have a complex structural analysis of the systems versus an individual experience. And not to discount it, but when we're talking about structural change, that does require a different level of understanding, knowledge, and expertise. So I'm really, really glad you highlighted that, because you don't hear that often.
I think it's for those two purposes, right? Because we don't want the burden falling onto folks who, quite frankly, aren't interested.
That's a reality too.
There are lots of people.
You might not want to.
Right? Like I'm living my own individual experience. I do not have the interest or desire in getting really effective at, instructing on structural change. Like, you have to develop skills around organizational development, psychology and behavior change, influence often without authority.
Leadership development,
Yes. Often training and learning is embedded into here.
What would you say, and you've kind of spoken to it indirectly, what are some of the common pitfalls that you've seen be made by organizations, or maybe, one you've experienced yourself in in the building of teams, when it comes to, let's get this crew together, or like you say, it often is one person and then it's two, and slowly by surely there's a full team. And even then, just to contextualize this for folks, we're not talking about a team of 20 or 30 or 40 here. We might be talking 6 to 8 to 10. So what are some of the common pitfalls that you think that, you can flag on field? If you see this, pause, stop, take a breather, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I will say one big flag is resourcing. One of the reasons that brought me to Zendesk, which is where I am now, is this is an organization that's resourcing the team, the budget for the work that we actually go out and do, right? Because it's do you have the people? Are they the people that have the right skills and interests to do this work, right? Did they actively choose to be in this work? And do they have subject matter expertise? Are they supported? Do they have the relationship capital, the access to leadership and decision making? Do they have just literal money? Because this work takes money.
Money. Can you just say that one more time?
Yeah. It takes money.
Continue.
Yes, it does. And so this leads us to some of the common pitfalls, which I've for sure experienced and sometimes, been a part of myself and have learned along the way. One is that you can't assume this work doesn't take money, right? Like, even in partnerships, right? When you want to get, we talked about that strategy. If you are small and you want to, really tap into communities and voices, you've got to pay those folks. you've got to show, if you're showing up in community social impact, in partnerships, right? Like you're asking a lot from communities. You got to add value back in. That's key. Even when you're small and early, there needs to be budget. And quite frankly, at this point, if there's not budget, there's not commitment. Like I'm going to name it. Like there's not authentic commitment. If you're in an organization that is not willing to put any money towards this work, and yet they say that it's important, there's some gap between. And what I think we'll probably get at, like performative allyship in this conversation at some point, because that is a pitfall. There is a possibility of companies who are well-meaning of saying that this work matters and saying they want to increase representation of particular populations. And there being a gap between those intentions and the reality of what's in place to actually be able to build out a roadmap to get there, to, really actually achieve those goals. So big thing is resourcing. Another pitfall I would say is, honestly, and this is really relevant in this moment in time when we're all feeling overwhelmed and there's just so much going on in the world, but we often expect the moon and the stars from DEI teams, particularly small, nimble, agile, incredible, diversity and inclusion teams. That is a recipe for burnout. This work is challenging on a good day because we all bring our own identities into it. Most of us are really personally motivated to do this work. We want to create bridges and coalitions and, amplify voices, enable and empower everyone to be part of transformative change, right? Like this is big.
It's a large
sort of hairy work. Yeah. Right. Like, and that's on a good day. And sometimes there are moments too, like having a conversation with a leader who is not as far along in their own awareness journey. And some of the things they're saying, quite frankly, are microaggressions and micro inequities that might impact you directly as a person in this work who holds identities and lived experiences. So you're navigating this, you're code switching a lot in this work. It's challenging. And we often go over capacity on these teams on what we expect for them in terms of how quickly they can do things, how much change they can help drive. And I would say a pitfall is not leaving a buffer. Like I don't ever want my DEI team working at 120% capacity on the regular, because you know what? There are things that happen out in the world that become microcosms inside our organization. Like there is a war going on, right? That impacts each and every one of us in different ways, and some of us in very disproportionate ways, but it will come into the workplace. These things that happen in our outside lives, if you will, very much directly come in, whether we are fully aware of that.
I'm glad that you said that, because oftentimes I feel like in certain conversations, there's this belief or desire that once we go into work, even if you're still home, working from home, or there's a current hybrid setup, or you're back in the office Monday through Friday, start to finish, there's this desire or belief that I get to shut off and lock in, and it's just the work, and there's no impact and infiltration of what's going on outside in the workplace. And with that, some companies even saying we don't do politics in the workplace, we don't do inclusion, we don't bring that inside. But if we really looked at it, our workplace is a microcosm, or are microcosms of the greater world, of society. So that's not really realistic. So I just love that you're amplifying that, because it's a piece that is often left out or underscored in a way, it should get a little bit more attention that it currently does across the board, really.
2 comments on that, because I love that you are sort of highlighting this. One, there's incredible work from Michelle Mijung Kim around the political is personal and how it comes into play at work. She also recently wrote a book called The Wake Up, highly recommend for anyone who's interested in being part of DEI work. An element to doing this work as diversity, equity, inclusion practitioners, it's inherent. We have to stay responsive. Like, I think that's actually a key skill that you build over time in this work. Like, how do we stay responsive to the needs of our employees? How do we constantly interrogate who are we centering and what's the impact? And how do we stay responsive, like you said, to those outside things that we know very much are impacting everyone? And it's culturally different depending on where you are in the world to some degree, but we're all whole human beings, right? No matter what. And we're moving through space that way. And I am grateful to the changing demographics of the workforce, because more and more employees are expecting companies to be advocating for policy changes, for structural changes like LGBTQ rights in the US, which in the southern states right now are really coming into a place that we need advocacy and to change. So their employees have new expectations of companies. And that's helping leaders, I think, evolve in their inclusive leadership journeys to understand, I may not see the exact connection to our day-to-day work, to your point, that kind of in the office moment, whatever it might be, but I'm hearing and understanding this is important to employees. So what can we do? How can we be part of bigger systemic change?
It's interesting that you raised that point in terms of like expectations that are increasing for many folks and leaving if expectations aren't being met and so forth and so forth. And to that, it was something that you said in there in terms of, all of the different laws and bills that are being passed in southern states. So Texas has been mentioned several times. There's different things happening there. Florida has been mentioned several times. I was just looking on my phone, and Missouri has passed, I think it's Missouri, that has passed a particular bill that makes it illegal to leave the state if parents want to receive care for their transgender child. So that, things are happening, yet some of these same companies that are pledging and providing money for Pride Month and saying like, here's this, donation to this organization, donation to this organization. And that same company is donating to politicians who are, giving the vote to pass these bills that are negatively impacting parents of trans children and trans children themselves. So I say all that to say, for a DEI team, how do you view holding up the mirror to leadership to say, what does actual commitment look like continuously, and not I'm for rights on Monday and on Tuesday I'm supporting someone who's boldly and directly not? Like, how do you hold the mirror to that?
A couple of things. Here are a few thoughts. They're a little scattered, but one, just this idea of holding the mirror to leadership, I think, is an incredibly powerful metaphor for us to hold as practitioners and leaders in this space. And I think it's really beneficial to be direct when you do this work with the leadership you're interacting with. Like, I have described to the folks I'm still meeting, leaders and getting to know and establishing relationships with Zendesk, because I'm only a couple months in, but in past experiences too, I like to call myself a compassionate challenger. That's the language I've come to use. And I'll say that to leaders. I say, you can think of me as a compassionate challenger. I'm going to challenge you when it is for the benefit of our employees, or when it is holding us accountable to commitments we've made, or when it is about aligning with the company's values, right? Like, I'm going to challenge, and it's going to be uncomfortable sometimes. I'm going to do it from a place of compassion and understanding that you are a human being on this journey with me, that we don't have it all figured out, and that we're learning as we go. And so, like, mistakes are going to be made, things are going to be tweaked, right? Like, sometimes aha moments. I mean, you started the call with like mic drop moments. I think that place of compassion is holding that belief that we all have the capacity for change, and that we all have been influenced by our own mic drop moments, and there are still more mics to be dropped, right? So how can we be together on that? And so that framing has been helpful to me. Like, I think it can be, if you are doing this work, as, or you want to do this work, being upfront and direct, right? Like, hey, I'm going to be the compassionate challenger.
I like that. I'm going to steal that from you. I would say borrow, but borrow insinuates I'm going to return it to you. So consider it stolen.
There you go. It is up for grabs. The other thing too is, we know that data and examples are just really powerful for most of us. Like the way our brains work, and particularly leaders in organizations have gotten so accustomed to kind of seeing data and information. And I think that can be a really helpful tool here too, right? Like, I think it's going to be really interesting, some of what we've been seeing with the war and the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine is we're seeing some companies pull out business from partnerships with Russia that they'd formerly held and make some pretty bold moves. That is a good example, potentially. This is just, me speaking a bit generally here, but that's a good example to point to as like, ooh, okay, there was a moment in time in which we took bold action in order to align with a commitment. Have we done that in other circumstances? Like, are we consistent in that, right? So you can use these data points to say, hey, here's an example of when we did this well. Right now feels like an example of when we're debating, right? Like, it feels like a mismatch. Why is it that we think this is a situation where we wouldn't want to, take action to be consistent or be aligned here? Like, not show up on a Monday supporting this and on a Tuesday directly, dismantling that support.
I like that idea of the mirror. And what's jumping out at me is this notion of transparency and accountability. Because when I think about, in particular, what's happening right now with Ukraine and Russia, just like you said, we've seen immense support in a way that I cannot recall seeing in other contexts. So it's like, okay, if someone feels that it's a positive thing or a bold statement, rather, because positive might not be the best word, but it's bold for a company or companies to say, we're not going to support this and this is our role. Your example with Ukraine and Russia, it could be a bold move to say as a company, we stand for this, and we're committed to this. And because of that, these are the decisions that we're going to make. And I think there's power and value there. And I think at the same time, using our analogy of the mirrors, like let's be transparent. And this might feel, using your language, uncomfortable. What about when it was Syria and Yemen and Palestine and other places? There wasn't such boldness there. And let's interrogate that. We are okay with prioritizing this group, but even within that, African students are having difficulty, getting out of the country and getting to safety. So even in this praise, it's like it's a little bit more complex than that. And having leaders get to a space, I love this compassion challenging of saying yes and XYZ.
I think this is looping back to some of what we started on who are we centering? Who are we not centering? What is the impact? What is it that drove us to make this bold decision? And what feels like it's keeping us from this one? Like, that's really doing the necessary work inside of ourselves and with each other, right? As we journey together, because there's layers to uncover. I mean, we know, and I've learned incredible things from Fearless Futures about the way systems of oppression work and manifest, and how do we peel back those layers to identify. I think it's almost like the transparency of the mirror. It's like a fun house mirror, right? And we have to say, like, okay, are we looking at this? If we look at this angle, does it change? Why? Why does it change? Why does this decision feel harder? Is it because there's some
underlying
manifestation
root here that we haven't interrogated? Even the language choices. I'm just thinking through Ukraine. Who is labeled a refugee versus who is not? And really spending time going through that. And what I'm hearing from you is this getting our leaders to slow down. Oftentimes in the DEI space, it's quick wins. What can we do? What can we achieve by end of Q1, Q2, end of year KPIs, all of that. There's danger in that when we don't take time to slow down, to properly identify what is the problem. Is the problem truly the problem? Or have we misidentified, the problem? And thus, any solution that we put into place, it's not going to solve the problem because it was never properly located.
I love that, Sable. I think those are all like really essential pieces of what are we actually trying to accomplish? Who does it serve? Who does it maybe not serve? Whose needs and experiences are we centering? Whose are we not? What is the impact? And is there more here that we might be missing? Like, I think that's always such a necessary question in this work. Is there more here we might be missing, right? And sometimes that's about, for everything, looking around and saying, well, wait a minute, right? If we're talking about supporting LGBTQ rights and we're in a room with leaders and only one of us belongs to the LGBTQ community, we are probably missing some things, right? If this is the decision-making space. How and what do we need to do? What do we still have questions around? What have we maybe not interrogated enough? Where do we feel like there might be gaps in accountability or pairing commitment with actions, right? Let's make sure this doesn't turn performative. Because that, I think, in my experience, a lot of the performative allyship or actions that have come from companies are typically well-intentioned, and it's because it's coming from a group that often has huge gaps in awareness and knowledge. And so are trying to put forward, like you said, solutions or ideas that are going to fall flat because they're not actually amplifying, empowering, and enabling the communities that are directly affected to really actually lead the way.
When you have a leader that suggests an action that is quite performative, what conversation, like how are you guiding the conversation to get them to realize, I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything. I'm just saying it should not be that. When there is such a gap in their knowledge when it comes to, this space and how sexism or racism or disableism might be showing up in the company, but then also within their suggestion, like there's something getting perpetuated here that's not going to do what you think it's going to do.
This is such a real context. Like, I actually think we do this work often. I think the Zendesk team would agree, like, we learn from each other in this too, right? Like the incredible GDEI team is navigating this all the time, and I get to learn from them. I think a couple things. My experience is we always want to channel enthusiasm. So there's some sort of bottling of that, right? There's different ways you can do that and acknowledge it and like call it out, right? And say like, I love that you want to be part of the change.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I love that you want to be actively plugged in here, right? Like, so part of it is, and it is important because this work can feel disheartening if we're not acknowledged or recognized or appreciated in it. And so that's a key piece. Because we want to keep that momentum, that excitement, that enthusiasm. And I would say most of the time, all of that is coming from such a great place, but is often either not the most strategic, or there are some gaps. There might be some, I'm going to use some Fearless Future language in here, some like operating
that are
logic.
At play. Yes.
That are at play that someone is not aware of, that actually are feeding into a stereotype or an incorrect assumption, or ultimately perpetuating systems of oppression, which we know that's how those operating logics work. And so a key skill here is listen and approach with curiosity. Like, when someone's coming from, I'm like, help me understand.
I love that, those
right? Like, what is it? Right? What is it that made you excited about this? Why is it that you think this is going to be, right? Like, and genuinely asking those questions. That's what I mean, come from that place of curiosity, not asking them with judgment, not asking them as leading questions, but genuinely. And usually in that dialogue, it becomes more evident to me where there might be a problematic operating logic or where there's a gap. And then there's an opportunity to bring awareness around that, right? And there are lots of ways to do this, again, from a place of compassion, but you're challenging someone's gap or you're challenging them. I often will say to folks, I'm always learning in this work. I am always going to assume that you too want to learn. Like, that's my default assumption, is that you're coming to this and we both have an open, curious mind and that you want to learn just like I want to learn. So when I see opportunities to help you learn or to, reveal a gap or an awareness, something, I'm going to do it because I owe that to you. You have a commitment to this. I want to help you learn. And if I let that go, you're not learning. And in fact, you might go act on this thing and we're going to be, right? Then we're going to be in a world where at the best case scenario, we're not achieving really the important strategic goals. At worst case scenario, harm is created unintentionally.
There's a thread here that has come through everyone we've spoken to thus far, but definitely in this conversation as well. It's not possible to do this work if you're going to shy away from the challenging conversations, because the challenging conversations do not disappear. You might not have, incredibly difficult conversations every day, but you can bet yourself at a minimum there's 2 a week, if not more, depending on, your specific role within the company and what it is that you're trying to do and work towards. And even us ourselves as practitioner being comfortable being uncomfortable. We know the other folks are uncomfortable. They might not be comfortable with it, but we ourselves have to get comfortable being uncomfortable, because the average human being does not want to engage in what they perceive to be conflict, even if it's generative, positive conflict that will lead us to a solid solution. It still can be very uncomfortable to disagree with someone.
That just sparked something in my brain, Sable. So we had some, there are some events that our employee communities are putting on for International Women's Day throughout, or International Women's Month and the day. There was one that I attended late one night this week that was centered in our APAC employees, because Zendesk is a global company. And there was this incredible facilitator talking about, just the ways in which limiting beliefs about others, it can affect the way we interact, and some great stuff there. And one of the things she reminded me of, I think I had known this before, but there's kind of neuroscience behind this that shows that most humans will avoid pain or perceived pain, basically no matter the cost. Like, even if we know that there's a really, really desirable reward after the pain, we're like, no, thank you. The idea of the pain is so hard. That we won't then seek the reward. And I thought, wow, that feels so applicable to what you just said, which is that, we shy away from conflict and uncomfortable conversations in most cultures. I will say, caveat, not all cultures and not all backgrounds and not all lived experiences, but generally in the way that sort of corporations have been built and designed, that's the norm. We know it's part of like white supremacy culture, unfortunately, and that's been replicated in a lot of organizations. One thing I do remind myself, and sometimes we'll say to people too, is like, well, we're talking about here, like the reason a conversation is hard is like, we're trying to unpack and unlearn sometimes decades of conditioning. It's not meant to be comfortable because we're talking about behavior change and we're talking about like, growing. So I often use the analogy, like I am someone who has not figured out how to consistently like floss my teeth. To this day, I still I only do it like for a month before I go in for my cleaning appointment, which I dread. And then I just can't do it consistently. And I use that example with leaders sometimes and with our employees to say, like, I'm avoiding flossing because it's uncomfortable and I have to get over that hurdle. And then it's not uncomfortable. And it's actually just part of a habit. And a lot of what we're doing in DEI work is like changing mindsets, changing habits, changing behaviors, unlearning.
And if you're wedded to what you know, and then you're exposed to something new, it can almost feel like a shock to the system. So to deprogram in order to redesign in the spirit of equity and inclusion, that is not an easy task. But I want to make sure I get this question in because I've asked it of everyone. So it's only right that I continue, and with this pattern here. If you could have dinner, well, I mean, it really could be lunch. I've been saying dinner, but let's just say break bread. If you could break bread with anyone in the equity space, past or present, who would this person be, Megan, and why?
One of the authors that has genuinely changed my life is Octavia Butler. I never fully understood when people said like, oh, I read this book and it changed my life. I was always like, are people being honest? Like I've loved books and I've read incredible folks. And then I discovered and read and immersed myself in the world of Octavia Butler's work. And in a way, she can be considered someone who does equity work because one, she was an incredible trailblazing pioneer as one of the first Black women in sci-fi literature, right? And she incorporates themes of humanity and equity in her writing. In sci-fi, like what, there's just so many layers of brilliance there. And there are concepts that I've learned from her stories and her work and her just personal, like there's some notes and things, there's fun things. If people haven't read Octavia Butler, obviously huge plug for that. And go on, the internet, there's some great like stuff that talks about just how she lived her life and she manifested certain things and her notes are really fun to see. There's some of that has been saved. She grew up in Pasadena, which is in the LA area. And there like sometimes are exhibits and museums. Like she's just amazing. I've learned incredible things. In particular, the idea of change, like she writes beautifully around the idea of change. And I know you said that in my bio, Sable, but like I hold on every day in this work to the belief that we are all capable of change and that change is constant.
You honestly have to have some level of hope. Some of us might be able to out-hope the other person, if you will, and I'm not trying to have a hope competition, folks, just to be clear, but you do have to have some level of hope to be in this space. Because if not, when the difficult days and conversations come, it'd be very, very challenging to try and, encourage yourself to participate if you don't have hope. I love Octavia Butler. I can nerd out about Octavia. So I'm just going to ask you because you're here. What's your it might not be fair to ask this, but do you have a favorite book of hers?
The two Parable books are, I think, the ones I'd have to say. And if you're going to start anywhere and you don't want to feel like you have to read a bunch of her books, which you will once you start to read them, listeners. But those are just two. She actually passed away before writing. It was originally supposed to be a trilogy. And she passed away unexpectedly before writing the third book. So that's also just interesting insight into kind of where the story could go. That leaves all of us opportunity to think about where it might have and could have gone. So it feels almost like a co-creation process with her.
Megan, it has been absolutely lovely chatting with you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy. Thank you for your insight and for sharing with us some pitfalls that truly are common with building an inclusion and equity team. You've done some great work in this space. So I just want to say thank you for your time again, Megan. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, Sable. The last thing, agreed. I mean, we could chat for hours. I'm just picturing us needing to get together in a coffee shop, bring Octavia Butler books and just, settle in for the day. But the last thing I will say, just in case this is helpful to folks, is find your champions and advocates. Like, we didn't talk too much about that, but that can be a great strategy for, especially if you're starting to see flags on the field where you're at. Find the people in the organization and outside of the organization that can help you champion for the right resources and for the right things that you need to do this work, because we need you.
And that is Megan's mic drop moment for the episode. Thank you so much for joining us today, Megan.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sable.